My name is Hae-jung Park. I'm a member of Philadelphia Committee for Peace and Justice in Asia. Yes. So as you know that as soon as Trump became the president, the tensions between North Korea and the U.S. Were escalated, and Trump called Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, Rocky Man. Rocky Man, and then also he said North Korea will be met with fire and fury, and he kept on using his, tweeting to attack North Korea. But since the Pyeongchang Olympics, a lot of things have happened, right? So a North Korean leader's sister, Kim Yo-jong, visited South Korea during the Olympic Games. And then also after that, a South Korean envoy, they visited North Korea. And it is announced that North Korean leader and South Korean leader, they're going to have a summit meeting on actually April 27th. And then also Trump accepted invitation from Kim Jong-un. So they're going to have a summit meeting at the end of May or early June. And then also Kim Jong-un also visited China, like a secret visit. So and then last week, South Korean K-pop stars and Taekwondo practitioners, they performed in North Korea. And the first concert, their theme was Spring is Coming. And then their second concert was We Are One. So, so within 2 months, so many things that happened. It's quite exciting, but at the same time, Trump recently appointed Mike Pompeo, as a U.S. Secretary of State, and then also he nominated John Bolton, as a National Security Advisor. So a lot of people know that they have very hawkish perspectives on North Korea. So it's and then also South Korea and U.S. armies, they started a joint military exercise on April 1st. So it's going to continue throughout the whole April. So I don't know, is spring coming?
Yes.
Or winter will continue. So a lot of people have questions about what's going to happen after Trump meet Kim Jong-un. That there will be a peace or there will be a war. So it's kind of a very critical moment we are in. So today's forum title is "Negotiate, Don't Escalate, and the U.S. Militarism in Korea." So we'd like to have some space and time to discuss what's going on. And also, we'd like to encourage you and your friends to call for there is a kind of later, Chuck is going to explain a little bit more about, people's call for a peace treaty to end the ongoing Korean War. So we'd like to ask your support. And today's event has been organized again by Philadelphia Committee for Peace and Justice in Asia, and also endorsed by Answer Philadelphia, Brandywine Peace Community, Granny Peace Brigade Philadelphia, International Action Center Philadelphia, and then we'd like to give a special thanks to Calvary Church for providing this space.
John's Union also.
I'm sorry?
John's Union also endorsed us.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
So the community college teachers.
And then, that's right. So teachers is a union, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the first speaker is Anne Wright. So Anne, just some, it seems a lot of people know her. As soon as people came in, they started hugging. So Anne Wright is a retired U.S. Army colonel and former State Department officer who resigned in protest of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. She is widely known as an international leader in the anti-war movement. Veterans for Peace and Code Pink, Women for Peace. She participated in the 2015 Women Cross DMZ when 30 international women peacemakers from around the world walked with thousands of Korean women, North and South, to call for an end to the Korean War, reunification of families, and women's leadership in the peace process. So I think Anne is going to more talk about starting from Women Cross DMZ and then current situation. And then after Anne Wright, we're going to have Hyun Lee, and she's going to give a kind of more broader perspective with the analysis, but I will introduce Hyun after Anne finishes. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Hae-jung. It's a pleasure to be here in Philadelphia, where we've seen great things happening. And the last time I was here was for the Challenging the Democratic National Convention 2 years ago. You all coordinated a lot of really, really good actions. But today we're here to talk about one of the crisis areas of the world, and that's the Korean Peninsula. And as Hae-jung mentioned, I was part of the 2015 Women Cross the DMZ. But that was not my very first time to talk about or be concerned about North Korea. When I resigned in 2003, 15 years ago, in my extensive letter of resignation, because I wanted to tell the Bush administration everything I thought they were doing wrong. So in that 4-page letter of resignation, it wasn't just about the Iraq War, but it was about the unbalanced policies of Israel and Palestine. It was about the unnecessary curtailment of civil liberties under the Patriot Act, and it was the lack of follow-through from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration on the issues of North Korea. So I put that in my letter of resignation, and then that was 2003, and then it was 2015, 12 years later, before I actually really started getting involved in the issue of things that were happening on the Korean Peninsula. Although I had been to Jeju Island many times on trying to end the militarization that was going on in the area, trying to stop that naval base. But on the issue of actually North Korea, it was the Women's Cross the DMZ. Now I'm going to show you some pictures of that because I don't think many of you have seen what happened when 30 women, 2 Nobel Peace Laureates, 30 women from 15 countries went to North Korea. How many of you all have ever been to North Korea? Hyun and Hae-jung. Joe?
I flew over.
You flew over. Well,
we were dropping leaflets over.
Oh, okay. Well, so we've got 2.5, I would say. 2.5. But the rest of you haven't been. And now it's real difficult to go because there's a special validation passport that you have to get in order to go. But when we went in 2015, that 30-woman group, 2 Nobel Peace Laureates, Marie Maguire from Northern Ireland and Leigh Gobi from Liberia. We also had Gloria Steinem with us. We were able to get visas from the North Korean mission in Beijing and then fly in. And we didn't need permission from the U.S. government. But now you do. And what did we see there? Well, one of the very interesting things is this beautiful statue. Although you can't quite see it, it's kind of fading out there. That statue is probably 4 stories tall, and it's women, 2 women holding hands above this big boulevard, and in the middle of it is a Korean peninsula as one. So is this called the Statue of Reunification or the Boulevard of Reunification? And one of the very interesting things that were there when we had a march for peace on the Korean Peninsula was this all-woman marching band. I mean, this looks like something out of Los Angeles, doesn't it? I mean, here they are in these remarkable outfits, and look at the T-shirt that the drum major has on. It has the Korean Peninsula as one, giving us an indication that indeed in North Korea, it's not like they're the enemies, that they want to have a peace treaty signed. They want, whether or not it's one unit, that whole peninsula, that's for the Koreans to decide themselves. But the fact that we found in all of the symposia that we had a symposium where North Korean women told us about the Korean War and the effects of it still to this day on people. And then members of our delegation who came from conflict areas of Northern Ireland, of the Philippines, of Colombia, of Liberia, told them about how the resolution happened in their countries, that wars and civil wars were ended. So it was really quite remarkable, and to see 250 North Korean women in that symposium as we talked, and then to have a communal group with the, how do you say the name of this blanket again? The Korean, Joubert. This was sewn together. North Koreans had made one of the patterns, and South Koreans had made one of the patterns, and internationals. And they were sewn together in this symposium in Pyongyang. And here we have a march. We marched in for peace on the Korean Peninsula in Pyongyang with 5,000 women there. We went down to Kaesong.
The whole conference was all women?
All women. All women. And then in Kaesong there were what? Pardon? 2,000 women. And the beautiful dresses that they had. I mean, this was a very important event for them, that 30 international women were there for peace, in their urging peace for both our government in the United States, the South Korean government, and North Korean government. And if you think back, 2.5 years ago, this was during the Obama administration, and there were the escalation of tensions were very, very high. We went to Panmunjom at the DMZ to look across at that place, which is going to be the place where it looks like the president of South Korea and Kim Jong-un are going to be meeting on April 25th. And then we crossed, this is a symbolic crossing, walking across the DMZ. We actually didn't, but we rode by bus, and we had a very good song leader on our bus. Hey Jung led us in Korean songs, and a Korean song of reunification. Yeah. And as we were going across the DMZ, coming into South Korea, looking out and seeing all sorts of people that had come to welcome this group of internationals that had come across the DMZ. Only the third time that a civilian group has been allowed to cross the DMZ. So to get the permission of both the North Korean government, the South Korean government, and the UN command, and the tacit approval of the United States government, it was quite a feat. It was quite a feat. And then once we got across into South Korea, we had a peace march with South Korean women right along the DMZ. And if you can see all the barbed wire and everything that the South Koreans have put up, and we walked along in between two of the corridors there. And then we had a big rally that was at Paju, which is the park, the Peace Park, right there at the DMZ. And thousands of Koreans were there, South Koreans were there to welcome the group. Then the next day in Seoul, South Korea, at the City Hall, the mayor of Seoul, South Korea, allowed this group of women to have a peace symposium in the City Hall. And what was it, 300 or 400 women from South Korea were there, and our delegation. And we talked to them about what the impressions we had from our trip into North Korea, because it had been several years, probably 5 years, that South Koreans had not been allowed to go into North Korea. Even for family reunification visits, they had not been allowed to do that. So we were bringing back information to them about what we were hearing from women of North Korea. So that was how I kind of got started. I was really honored to be a part of that very small group that went to North Korea. And the group has continued its activities. We have been going to the United Nations every year as a part of the Commission on the Status of Women. We've been back to South Korea both in 2015, 16, and 17 to participate in the peace marches that every year are being held there. In January of this year, we mobilized again to go to Vancouver, British Columbia, to be there for the meeting of the ministers, the foreign ministers of the UN command countries, those countries that participated in the Korean conflict. And those foreign ministers, some 17 of them, were meeting. And we were there to say, we want maximum engagement, not maximum pressure. That's been the mantra for the governments, maximum pressure. Let's get all the sanctions on the Koreans, the North Koreans. Let's just squeeze them until they say uncle. not Uncle Ho or Uncle Kim, and what impressions were there? I mean, the countries have been closing down North Korean embassies. They've been kicking out North Korean diplomatic officials. They've cut off imports or exports from North Korea. They've reduced imports that are going in. The U.S. South Korea war games, war practices, B-52, B-2 flights along the DMZ, and U.S. aircraft carriers and submarines have been right around the Korean Peninsula. So that's what the maximum pressure was. And we were saying maximum engagement. Well, at that point, in the middle part of January, even though we had lots of women that were standing outside, and men, outside the convention center in Vancouver, British Columbia, and even though we'd gotten the Canadian government for the first time in our knowledge, to set up a symposium that civil society could participate in. It's the first time a government that's hosting one of these has set up a symposium where supposedly they will listen to civil society. We didn't get into the actual meetings of the foreign ministers, but that was a first step. And of course, everybody in civil society was saying, engage, negotiate, talk, dialogue. This continued pressure is not what's going to result in peace, but engagement is. But we left there kind of disheartened because the foreign ministers came out with a horrible statement of more maximum pressure, more maximum pressure. Well, shortly after the Vancouver conference was another conference that was held in South Korea. And this was an international peace conference at the end of January. And it was kind of associated with the Olympics. I mean, we associated it with the Olympics. I don't think the Olympics associated with us that much, but we picked up on theirs. And here are 4 of us, 3 from South Korea, good friends who've been part of the peace symposiums that we've had all the time at the peace symposium. And this is the beautiful scarf that's the symbol of Women Cross the Demilitarized Zone. And here's kind of the front cover of the book of this peace symposium, where about 300 people, mostly from South Korea and many from right along that border area of the DMZ, a place that I had not been to before, and it was a place that I almost froze to death. If you look in here, that's a frozen river. It must be frozen down to about 500 feet. And that waterfall, I mean, it was so cold. I live in Hawaii. And listen, there's a reason I don't want to leave Hawaii from about the middle of December until May. And one of them, when they said, would you like to go to South Korea to be at this peace conference? It was like, I would like to be at the conference, but could I Skype in? I mean, I don't want to. And then when we got there and I looked out the window from the hotel, it was holy samoli. Well, but it meant that the Olympics went really well because it was cold there. They were getting, but it was a warm spirit.
It's so warm there.
Yeah. Oh, listen, you wouldn't believe how warm that hotel room was that was right. I was up there. But it was a fascinating thing. As a part of the conference, we actually went to the DMZ, which was only about 3 miles from the hotel where the conference was being held. And interesting things in the DMZ. Here was the crane park. The cranes, big cranes. Well, their cranes are right along the DMZ because there aren't a lot of hunters or anything like that are firing at them, so they live a pretty nice life in the DMZ. So an international crane center has been set up. And then in this civilian controlled access area that you have to have the special permission of the South Korean government to go in on their side of the DMZ. Here is this beautiful, beautiful building, said DMZ on it, very modern and everything. And guess what was in it? It was the Border Peace School. Who's ever heard of that? Yeah, they have a peace school that's located in the DMZ. It's an international peace school. And I've put the email for the director, Dr. Sejok Jung, who is a wonderful guy. They have 10 internationals that are doing graduate work and peace studies there. And so if anybody's interested, get in touch with him. It's remarkable. And right up and in that area, here's one of the beautiful statues. You see a lot of very poignant statues there. You saw a train station on the South Korean side of the DMZ that still has the tracks that can be opened up. If there is an opening, that train station can be another one of the routes right into North Korea for the movement of people, goods, whatever needs to happen for reunification. Now this peace school that we're talking about, every afternoon they go to a hill for a meditation, a silent meditation, and they walk up this hill and then they can overlook North Korea. And while they're there, they have they do a silent meditation this time. While we were up there, they decided we'd have a little talking since we were there, and some signs, so we had the peace sign. And these signs, you can be guaranteed the North Koreans know this. I mean, they've got as good of binoculars as we do. And when the kids go up for their daily vigil, I'm sure those binoculars are looking right over. And when we were up there, they saw this peace sign, and they saw our little sign from Women Across the DMZ and Veterans for Peace. And they saw us as we were up there saying, "No war on North Korea." So that was very interesting toward in the middle of January when we were up there for that International Peace Conference. But still going on were these war of words in February before the Olympics started. The war of words where the United States, Trump was saying fire and fury, little rocket man, all these pejorative things. And the North Koreans who are equally as good. In fact, I really enjoy some of the terms that they use for George Bush and for Donald Trump. Dotard, and I mean, who'd ever heard of that one for years? But man, they must have gone through the thesaurus and really started picking out some good ones for him. So, here was the war of words that were going on among the leadership. And yet former leaders, including Jimmy Carter, Bill Perry, George Shultz, were all writing op-eds and saying, you've got to negotiate, you've got to talk to people. But then you had these military war games, war practices still continuing. And people were saying, you've got to suspend, scale down, redesign, reassure. There are a lot of things you can do besides war games. And then the Olympics happened, and then some very incredible things happened. I mean, this picture I love. This one I will. Here you have Kim Jo-jung. Pardon?
Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty and the Beast, right here, where the North Korean delegation came to South Korea. I mean, and if you look at it, I mean, having been a diplomat for 16 years and having been involved in presidential visits and things like that, I can only imagine the level of security concern that the South Koreans had for inviting the sister of Kim Jong-un to come and the high-level delegation to come into South Korea. They must have been on pins and needles hoping and praying that nothing was going to happen to her. And then you had sister diplomacy, and in some very amazing, amazing photographs where you have North Korean leadership and South Korean leadership shaking hands. Shaking hands. You have Kim Yo-jong going to the Blue House, the equivalent of the White House. I mean, who would have thought about that at the end of January, that these things were going to be happening? And if you look at the expressions on these faces, I mean, finally the leadership getting together to talk as human beings, to show dignity and respect to each other instead of a war of words. So these pictures are the things that give me really, really great hope that the humanity is coming finally. That once people have a chance to meet each other face to face, to actually talk and not listen to each other on TV, that maybe we'll have some breakthroughs, which we are seeing now. And just to kind of give you a little view of who this young woman is that was the face of North Korea. And I'm sure they thought long and hard about who they were going to send. And I think they certainly picked the right person to come. She is the only full-blooded sister of Kim Jong-un, although there are other half-sisters that he has. She's the vice director of the Women's Party of Korea Propaganda and Agitation Department, so she's got a background in media and things like that. She was just selected in October to be a part of the Politburo of the country, so she's very high level, and she's known as a person that has her brother's back and is kind of the gatekeeper for her brother. She's married, apparently, to the 10 minutes left, thank you. Okay. And she studied abroad in Switzerland, as did her brother. And then the next thing that happened, another very strange thing, and that we didn't find out about till kind of like as it was happening, was that Kim Jong-un secretly headed for China. And the only way we found out about it in the United States was that this big, heavy train that normally takes the leadership of North Korea anywhere, all of a sudden it was seen in Beijing. So what's happening here? Well, a lot was happening. Look at what was happening. The Chinese had prepared for this. It wasn't a secret visit to them. They'd been preparing. So on March 26th and March 27th, Kim Jong-un met with President Xi. And big things, respect of having people come to dinner, to a state dinner, to walk in the gardens and have a chance to talk. And this was even before, on March 29th, when the Minister of Reunification of South Korea met with the equivalent of North Korea at Panmunjom. So this happened before the first meeting between the North and South Koreans actually occurred. So what's going to happen? As Hae-jung mentioned, on the 27th, they're going to have the meeting of the two leadership of North and South Korea. And just to kind of give you a history of this, it's only the third meeting ever held between the leaders of the two nations. Only the third time in 70 years. 70 years. And you can read there the various other times that this had happened. And they'll meet at the Peace House, which is in Panmunjom on the South Korean side, which no doubt, that's a big security risk for the North Koreans to have their leader go across into South Korea. And he would be the first North Korean to set foot in the South since the Korean War. That's big stuff. And then what's next? Well, in May, at some time, we hope there will be a meeting. Here you have Donald Trump, 71 years old, versus Kim Jong-un, 34 years old. Such a disparity, but complications can arise. And the nominee for new Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, that's a complication. In fact, I'll be down in Washington on Thursday at his confirmation hearing, where I anticipate by the afternoon I will be in jail, as I was for the Attorney General of the United States. Had to go to jail to say, no, I don't like that guy. And I don't like Pompeo either, because he's not one that's for peace on the Korean Peninsula, nor is John Bolton. Evil John Bolton, I would say. I've got a history with him when I was in the State Department. This man is a lunatic. He is a yeller, screamer. He is a terrible leader. He is a terrible personality with other people, and he is exactly the wrong person for that job. So who will we have on our team? Well, it doesn't look like it's going to be good. Trump, Pompeo, Bolton. No, we have no U.S. ambassador in South Korea. We have no special envoy to North Korea. And the only woman in higher position in the bureaucracy of the United States is Nikki Haley, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who is as bad as all of them. Why are we concerned? The United States is a signatory to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which calls for women to be involved in negotiations. We call for South Korean women to be a part of the negotiations with the North Koreans, and we call on our government to put the right women in negotiating positions. How do we get that? Well, we have to keep pushing on it. We have to show visibility. So the next thing that our group is going to be doing, we're taking another 30 women to South Korea in May. And it may overlap at the time that Trump and Kim Jong-un are having their discussions. We're going to have a peace symposium in Seoul. We had hoped that we would be able to take this group into North Korea, but with all of the things that are happening, the North Koreans have said, we got too much on our plate to even think about that. So we'll be in South Korea, we'll do a symposium, we'll do a peace walk, and we will be lobbying for visibility, for participation for women at these negotiations. And what can we do? I mean, it's tried and true. Keep putting pressure on the Congress in any way that you can to stop the confirmation of Pompeo, and say that Bolton, who doesn't have to be confirmed, to get him out of there. Write op-eds to your newspapers, letters to the editors, and support the inclusion of women in negotiations. And support in any way that we can South Korean President Moon in his effort to come to an agreement on the peace for the Korean Peninsula. So that's kind of a history of some of the things that we've been doing, and a little bit of a glimpse into the future, but we'll get a really good glimpse by our next speaker. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Flying all Philadelphia. The next speaker is, and also just during the Q&A, I just want to mention that Anne was in Palestine and also recently came back from Vietnam. So maybe something, global context, it might be interesting. Korea, Vietnam, Palestine, what's going on. The next speaker is Hyun Lee. Hyun Lee is the managing editor of Zoom in Korea, an online resource that provides timely updates on major news stories related to Korea, particularly exploring topics of the fight for democracy in South Korea as well as peace and unification on the Korean Peninsula. This blog also aims to showcase or highlight critical analysis and historical context that are often lacking in mainstream media coverage of the Korean Peninsula, especially in moments of a crisis. So, Hyun, thank you.
Oh, yes. Wait just one second. Apologies, we didn't get the...
Hyun Lee.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Hi. So I'm sorry, I don't have any nice pictures to accompany my presentation. It's just going to be me talking. So I'm going to share some thoughts about the upcoming the two summits that are coming up. The North-South Summit, which is going to happen at the end of this month on April 27th, and then followed by the Kim-Trump Summit, which will most likely happen in May. So first, let's talk about the North-South Summit. So as Anne mentioned, this summit will be the third inter-Korean summit. And for the summit to be successful, I think it's very important that it builds on what was already achieved at the first two summits. So it's important for us to know what was agreed to in the first two summits. So I'll go over that very quickly. So the first one in 2000 was between former President Kim Dae-jung and North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. And there were four main things that they agreed to. One was they're going to resolve the question of reunification independently through, quote, through the joint efforts of the Korean people who are the masters of the country. So what does this mean? It means it will not be determined by foreign powers, and it will not be a top-down, state-to-state process, but one that the main force of reunification will be the Korean people. The second thing that they agreed to is that, and this is kind of technical, there's a common, they said there's a common element in the South Korea's concept of confederation and the North's formula for a loose form of federation. So they agreed to promote reunification in that direction. So we can talk about what that means technically later. But basically they agreed to a general vision for what unification will look like. The third thing is that they will discuss humanitarian issues such as reunions of separated family members and also the repatriation to North Korea of unconverted communists serving prison sentences in South Korea. So during Kim Dae-jung's presidency, many of them were released and sent to North Korea, and they're now living well in North Korea. And then the fourth thing is economic cooperation exchanges between civic, cultural, sports, health, and environmental and all other fields. So those were the four things. So in other words, the two leaders agreed on the basic principle and then the general vision of reunification, and then initial steps that they would took towards that vision. And then that was followed in 2007 by the second summit, and that was between Roh Moo-hyun in South Korea and also Kim Jong-il in North Korea. And they agreed, they had like 10 points of agreements. But the first thing is they reaffirmed the first agreement, the 2000 agreement, and they again mention the first clause of their agreement is resolve the issue of unification according to the spirit of by the Korean people themselves. So that's an important thing that keeps coming up. The other things that they agreed to that I will mention is one, this is actually very interesting. They both agreed to overhaul their respective legislative and institutional apparatuses to develop inter-Korean relations in a reunification-oriented direction. So they both decided to make internal changes so that they can, in the future, reunify. Also, the other thing they talked about is they agreed to work together to bring the leaders of the 3 or 4 parties directly concerned on the Korean Peninsula to declare an end to the Korean War, work together to build a permanent peace regime. So replace the armistice regime with a permanent peace regime. They talked about economic cooperation projects like a special peace zone in the West Sea, also building a railroad between Kaesong and Siniju, an expressway between Kaesong and Pyongyang, a cooperative shipbuilding venture, non-stop flight services between Seoul and Mount Baekdu. So these are the kinds of things that they agreed to in 2007. Unfortunately, the very next year after the 2000 summit, there was an election in South Korea, and the conservative government of Lee Myung-bak took power. And then for 10 years after that, during the Lee Myung-bak administration and then the Park Geun-hye administration, none of the 2007 agreement was carried out. And then a lot of the projects that were started after the 2000, the very first agreement, were actually rolled back. As you know, we skip forward, and then Park Geun-hye was now impeached through mass protests in South Korea, and now we have a new president, Moon Jae-in, who seems very eager to resume the inter-Korean dialogue that had been stalled for the past 10 years, but seems also very cautious about managing his relationship with the United States. I think the upcoming summit will resume many of the inter-Korean projects that had been put on hold. So, for example, reunions of separated families, I'm sure we can expect to happen this year. Resumption of economic cooperation and cultural exchanges. I do think that these things will happen towards the end of this year. But for the summit to be a truly successful summit, I think what is important is that the two leaders need to reaffirm, once again, the principle of independent reunification where the Korean people are the determining force. That has not been mentioned by the South Korean president in the lead up to the talks so far, but we still have a few weeks to go, and I think that will be a very important thing for it to be discussed at the summit. Now, moving on to the Trump-Kim summit. Many people are wondering, or the question that I get a lot is, Kim Jong-un really serious about denuclearization? Of course, I can't answer that question, but I think it's important to look at North Korea's statements on the upcoming summit to understand what they might envision for the talks. So there was a press announcement on March 6th by the South Korean delegation that went to North Korea and met with Kim Jong-un. And then upon their return, they said 3 things related to denuclearization. One, North Korea made clear its will to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. They said if military threats against the North are resolved and the security of its system is guaranteed, it has no reason to possess nuclear weapons. 2, they are ready to have candid talks with the United States on denuclearization and normalization of relations. 3, They said, as long as talks continue, we will not resume nuclear or ballistic missile tests. Also, they confirmed we will not use our nuclear or conventional weapons against South Korea. And then recently, when Kim Jong-un went to China to meet with Xi Jinping, he also said a couple of things. One, it is our consistent stand to be committed to denuclearization on the peninsula in accordance with the will of late President Kim Il-sung and late General Secretary Kim Jong-il. So they're saying this is the will of the four fathers of North Korea. And then the issue of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula can be resolved if South Korea and the United States respond to our efforts with goodwill, create an atmosphere of peace and stability while taking progressive and synchronous measures for the realization of peace. So North Korea is raising two important matters that it wishes to discuss at the upcoming talks. One, normalization of relations between North Korea and the United States, and two, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So what do these things mean? One, normalization means obviously creating normal relations between the two countries. So normal trade, travel, having embassies in each other's countries, normal lines of communication, just like the United States has with any other country. Which means they first need to end the Korean War. The main parties of the war that signed the armistice back in 1953, which are basically the United States and North Korea, they need to declare an end to the war, replace the armistice with a peace treaty. Former ambassador to South Korea, James Laney, said back in 2008, this was the beginning of the Obama administration, on U.S.-North Korea negotiations, he said, quote, one item should be at the top of the agenda in order to remove all unnecessary obstacles to progress. That is the establishment of a peace treaty to replace the truce that has been in place since 1953. One of the things that have bedeviled all talks until now is the unresolved status of the Korean War. A peace treaty would provide a baseline for relationships, eliminating the question of the other's legitimacy and its right to exist. Absent such a peace treaty, every dispute presents afresh the question of the other side's legitimacy. So I think that is actually a very important thing to keep in mind. And then the second thing that North Korea raises is the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. What does this mean? This means getting rid of all things that pose a nuclear threat to the Korean Peninsula. So that includes North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, as well as U.S. strategic assets that are in Okinawa and Guam, the war exercises and the war operation plans that include nuclear first strike plans against North Korea. It's worthwhile for us to look at North Korea's government spokesperson statement back in July 2016 on removing U.S. nuclear threats on the Korean Peninsula. And they said, if the U.S. does the following things, we will reciprocate in kind. And it was 5 main things. 1, all nuclear weapons of the United States and South Korea must be publicly disclosed. 2, all the nukes and their bases should be dismantled and verified in the eyes of the world. It doesn't specify exactly where. They don't say all the nukes in South Korea or in the region or in the world, but basically they say, I think they mean nukes and bases that can threaten the Korean Peninsula should be dismantled. 3, ensure that the U.S. will never bring again the nuclear strike means to South Korea, which the U.S. has frequently deployed on the Korean Peninsula and in its vicinity. 4, stop intimidating North Korea with nuclear weapons. 5, withdrawal of the U.S. troops holding the right to use nukes from South Korea. So in other words, North Korea is not offering to give up its nuclear weapons as an act of capitulation to maximum pressure. What it wants is to leverage its strength as a now de facto nuclear weapon state for a fundamental resolution of all issues related to the conflict, the long-standing conflict with the United States. So then, what is the best path forward? Obviously, none of this will be resolved overnight. and will require an involved process. But for the upcoming Kim-Trump summit to be successful, it has to be a dramatic turning point from what we saw last year, which was mainly escalation of threats. And it has to pave the way for a constructive process. And it also has to be very qualitatively different from all the talks that they've had in the 90s and the 2000s, where the US was basically not really interested in resolving the issue, but what the US was trying to do is tie North Korea in these talks that drag out for a long time to stall their nuclear weapons development. Many people, understandably, are very doubtful about the upcoming talks, but I actually see signs that we may see a turning point in US-North Korea relations at the upcoming summit. So just yesterday, there was an article in The Hill where they said Pompeo has been engaged in secret back-channel talks with the North Koreans to set the logistics and the agenda of the summit. So it seems it will happen. And it also means that Trump will not walk into the talks blind. That is a good thing. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that on April 1st, Lindsey Graham was on Fox News. And of course, he's mainly giving credit to Trump for his maximum pressure campaign, and that's really the reason, that's what brought Kim Jong-un to the table. But he mentioned the possibility of ending the Korean War and discussing a peace treaty at the upcoming summit. This is the guy who had just a month before that had advocated war with North Korea. Now suddenly he's talking about a peace treaty on Fox News. So, I mean, it might be that he's just a very erratic guy, or he might be privy to something that we're not. At any rate, I think ending the Korean War and replacing the armistice with a peace treaty to normalize relations would be the best outcome of the Kim-Trump summit, because then what that does is it paves the way for constructive dialogue on concrete steps towards denuclearization, meaning removing all things that pose a nuclear threat to the Korean Peninsula. If we have learned anything from past US-North Korea negotiations that went on for 20 years with no real outcome, it is to expect a lot of pushback from very powerful forces that have a vested interest in maintaining tension on the Korean Peninsula. They will impede all steps towards progress. So for the peace process to actually succeed, the forces that desire peace have to be just as strong and very well organized. So I appeal to everyone here to continue to educate on and call for lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula, starting with a peace treaty to replace the armistice at the upcoming Kim-Trump summit.
So before we open the floor, I would like to make a, I'm going to ask Chuck Esser to talk about a little bit about the petition campaign. And also, if you have some cash, we are trying to, the Catholic Church is also, they are reconstructing the building and they provide the space, but we'd like to make a donation. So if you can make a donation, we'd appreciate.
So we wanted to have something that people could do today, and there has been a national petition drive for a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula, and it's a very simple one. You can sign here. There are about 63,000 people who signed it so far, and by the end of April, we hope to have 100,000 people, and it will be presented to all the relevant people in our government and also the South Korean government. So just a very simple statement, and it's something you can do right away. So this is up here for you to sign, and we'll send it in to the people who are collecting this petition. Oh, we can circulate it now.
Okay, so now floor is open, and if you have some questions or comments, Anyone? Yes.
Yes, for Hong Lee, you mentioned the forces in
Answer? Should I answer? I think the main forces that are opposed to, that have a vested interest in making sure that military tensions continue on the Korean Peninsula is actually the military-industrial complex. So the U.S. Sells a lot of weapons to countries in that region, mainly South Korea and Japan. I think South Korea is it's one of the top 5 countries that imports weapons from the United States. The U.S. wants to build a missile defense system in the region that connects Japan and South Korea as part of its broader missile defense system that is really aimed at China and also Russia and North Korea. North Korea has always served a good sort of boogeyman or justification for the U.S. to have its military presence in South Korea and also to continue to sell weapons. So, those are the forces that will, will impede any progress towards peace. Yes. So we, as people who want peace, we also need to be we need to be quick in terms of our assessment of what is happening, and we also need to be very well organized to make sure that this process that hasn't even begun yet, it is about to begin and will be a long and difficult, challenging process, that makes sure that that is a process that succeeds towards lasting peace.
Considering how the Orange One is so interested in maximum sanctions, is it possible that the U.S. and EU central bankers can be held off from their evilness by somehow the northern sector of the peninsula being able to become allied with renminbi and yuan or blockchain Bitcoin to duck sanctions from where they've been coming from for so long? Is that a possibility, or would that be seen as an actual hostile move?
I didn't quite understand.
What I'm trying to ask is, if in fact Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea could duck the sanctions, could escape the pain of the sanctions by going with Bitcoin or blockchain,
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes.
or the cover, the umbrella cover
Yeah.
of yuan renminbi money, would that
Right.
help them escape the EU and U.S. sanctions, the central banker sanctions?
Right. I see.
Go right.
So I don't know the answer to that question, but I will say some of you have heard me talk here a couple months ago about North Korea's economic development and how they are actually able to, I don't want to say evade the sanctions, but be quite resilient despite the sanctions. And there's been a real focus on science and technology in their process of economic development. I will just mention one example, just to give you an idea of how resilient North Korea has been in building their economy. So, in the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was their main source of crude oil for North Korea. And then also there were these choking sanctions that basically brought their economy to the brink of collapse. And then in the mid-1990s, there were a series of major floods that basically waterlogged all of their mines. North Korea is 80% mountains, so extractive industries, mining, especially coal, is like the heart of their industry. because they didn't have energy to pump the water out of their mines were basically waterlogged for about 15 years. And that was the root of their economic difficulty. And this is the period they call the Arduous March. That was in the 90s and Arduous March. That was in the 90s and the 2000s. So North Korea had this idea. So they were trying to figure out, how do we get water to our fields to continue agriculture without the irrigation pumps, without electricity to run the irrigation pumps. And they had this idea, well, we have all these mountains where water naturally collects. Let's build these reservoirs on top of the mountains and then make a series of dams and waterways that will guide the water from the top of the mountains to the fields by gravity. This is what they set out to do. So they mobilized tens of thousands of people from all over the country. You know, they recruited volunteers from women's leagues, youth leagues, university students, the army. They all came together and they worked on these waterway projects. And in the beginning, they didn't have energy to run machinery. So all of it was done by human labor. They constructed hundreds of miles of what they call waterways and tunnels through these very rugged mountainous conditions. It took them 20 years. Now this project is completed. They can now farm and irrigate all of their fields with very little reliance on electricity. So this is the kind of ingenuity, that they were forced to work with because of the sanctions. There are many other examples like this, but obviously the sanctions, yes, they do hurt. Without the sanctions, North Korea's economy would be so much better. People's livelihoods would be so much easier. But because of the sanctions also, they have had to be very creative and also super organized in order to find a way to survive. And I think that they have been very resilient. If you're interested in learning more about this, it is a series of articles that I'm working on right now for Zoom in Korea, so you can go there, and I think next week there will be a new part to the series that will be published on fertilizer production.
Thank you.
What's your kind of thoughts on Pompeo and John Bolton tours for northeast region, what they're thinking, or just based on your experience of working with them, or the importance of northeast region to the U.S.
Well, unfortunately, my assessment is going to be pretty disturbing and negative. Both Pompeo and Bolton are no friends of dialogue. They are both war hawks, and I think Trump is going to have a very difficult time with his senior staff on his desire to meet with Kim Jong-un. And the one thing I'll give Trump credit for, and this is the only thing, is that he, from the very beginning when he was running for president, he said, I will meet with them. I'll meet with everybody. And he's following through on that, much to the chagrin and just horror of his senior advisors. I mean, he apparently made the decision that he and tweeted that he would meet with Kim Jong-un nobody said, well, we know that he contacted his chief of staff, his secretary of defense, his secretary of state, and all of that. All of a sudden, it was just a tweet out there. So I think there are a lot of forces behind the scenes of the very conservative people that he's surrounded himself with who don't want this to happen. And if it does happen, they are going to be creating a whole master list of everything that will, they hope will derail this process. I mean, I think they will demand from the very beginning that before the U.S. does anything, that the North Koreans have to agree to inspection of their nuclear weapons systems, and I think they're going to have a whole list of things that the North Koreans are going to say, well, no, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a negotiation. It's not supposed to be a whole set of demands that we have to meet before you even talk to us about a thing such as a peace treaty. So that's my negative assessment of it. If it comes out better than that, I would say it's because of the strength of Trump to say to these guys that he's now appointed. I mean, this is, for him to have appointed these two people right now is not encouraging at all. And if he is able to withstand what we know will be their recommendations, then I'll be shocked.
They have to be approved by Congress.
Only one of them has to be approved. In fact, John Bolton will begin his operation as National Security Advisor. It's an appointed position in the middle part of this next week. Pompeo has to be confirmed, but he is still the CIA director, so he has a lot of influence right now anyway. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And while I think there will be people within the bureaucracies that would like to see finally some negotiations start, I think those two characters that are part of Trump's team are going to do everything they can to derail it. My only hope is that Bolton, as he is prone to do, will start making his own pronouncements and get ahead of Trump and maybe get fired before this happens. And I'll say, let me just answer or comment on one other thing about the sanctions of North Korea and how the North Koreans have been so creative about trying to work with all of these sanctions hanging over them. You know, when you talk to a lot of other people in other countries that have had these sanctions on, in fact, I met with 4 Russian women who are now traveling the United States. We met with 2 of them while I was on a trip to Russia in 2014. And they said that while, yes, there are some sanctions that the U.S. and EU has put on Russia because of the annexation of Crimea, that in one way, though, it's been helpful because it's forced the Russian government or the Russian society to rebuild those industries that they had been counting on as a part of the world trade system to take up the slack. Or, you know, China does the clothes, so-and-so does this, so-and-so does that. And now there's a lot of domestic production that are keeping people employed, and they've got plenty of natural resources in Russia, that's for sure. But these 4 women, who are all business women, were saying, yeah, some of the sanctions do hurt, but on the other hand, we have become much more self-reliant, and in one way, thank you very much for the sanctions. And in fact, they did say, and maybe you, the United States, should have some sanctions put on you, which I said, yes. But, you know, because we are so, we cannot, in today's world, we cannot supply ourselves with what we need. If China, if we tick off China, we're going to be naked next week. We're going to have, I mean, we don't have any clothes. We don't have, if you think of the products that are made by everybody else in the world for us at cheap prices, it wouldn't hurt us to have a few sanctions, and we have to become a little more self-reliant, in my opinion. Thank you.
In the everyday life of the North Korean people, I hear the public housing program where North Korean people don't necessarily pay rent, and they're sort of guaranteed a place to live, you know, no matter if they have a job or not. Okay, they're just in a society which the basic necessities of life are not something to fight over, and it's just a right you have as an other country. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so education, housing, healthcare, all of those things are guaranteed. And another thing that I talked about in my last talk here is now they have reorganized their society so that every unit of society, for example, like academic institute, like a university or a factory, now they have cooperative farms and small, what do you call it, like livestock breeding, not a ranch, but a livestock farm, and greenhouses that they all cooperatively maintain to feed themselves. So they're not so reliant on the central sort of public distribution system, but they have these autonomous sort of cooperatives. And what I thought was really cool is that the ratio of people who are expected to go out and work in whatever their job is, and then the ratio, and then the people who are doing sort of the reproductive labor of farming and taking care of the livestock and stuff, is 1 to 2. And I thought, that makes so much sense, because any one of us who do household work know how much work that really is, and it's never accounted for. But to have 2 people take care of the household for one person who goes outside to work, I mean, I think that makes so much sense. Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't spend too much time there. I was there in 2011 just for 2 weeks, so I can't say much about the everyday life. But another interesting thing that I learned there was we went to there's a big library called the Grand People's Study Hall. It's the largest library in Pyongyang. And I just asked my guide a question, like, what happens if somebody turns in their book late? And then they said, oh, well, their entire factory unit can't take out a book until that book is returned. So it is a very collective society in that sense. Yeah. So everybody is collectively responsible for their unit.
I know that they also, when I visited North Korea, also housing is a big issue. So, and usually a lot of houses, apartments, 2 generations or 3 generations live together. And then a couple who has a new baby, they have to wait, or more children, they have to wait until the district approves, the bigger housing units. So, it's very systemized, but also there is a waiting list, and and then housing. They are building more houses, but still, multi generations live together. There was.
May I just add one thing? And I mean, this is just from my tiny little observation from only 4 days that we were there in North Korea. There is a great disparity between what's in the cities and what's out in the rural areas, and both housing and probably in schools, I would think. I think the rural areas really get the short change of it, as most countries do. But when you look at what North Korea has been able to do, considering all of these things that have happened to it, I mean, they've developed, for God's sakes, a nuclear weapon, or 20 of them. They put satellites into space. It's not like they're a bunch of dummies there. They have some very, very, very smart people. And if they had a ghost of a chance, the rest of, the whole society could move very, very quickly, as we've seen in other places. For the reunification of East Germany, all of a sudden, things became very, very more equal very, very quickly. And the North Koreans just need to have a chance. Just need to have a chance. That's all they need. And talking to people that have been in North Korea over the years versus us, our group that was there in 2015, people were saying, well, this is a light years. What you're seeing now is much different from what it was 10 years ago. People have a different type of clothing. You can see that there are things that are coming across the border, probably illegally from China, but clothes are being sold on the streets. There's a private sector now. I mean, after your collective farm turns in its food to the government, The government allows you to keep a certain amount and you can sell it. There's television that's there, and if you're along the border, you can even pirate in on Chinese television, so I've heard, but you have to be careful about it. But, you know, and they are focusing on certain kinds of markets. Like, did you know you can go on a beer tour of North Korea? Yes. Yeah. They brought in some Czech and Polish brewmeisters, and apparently in the basements of every one of the international hotels are little microbreweries. And so in Beijing, there's these 3-day beer tours to North Korea. It may have been what Otto Warmbier was on when he decided to rip off that poster on the wall that got him in big trouble. So you don't want to drink too much beer while you're there. But they are trying to develop a tourism industry, and you know, all they need is a chance.
Yeah, Betsy.
I think also from what your slide said, the North has maintained a lot of the cultural integrity, which can be a very important factor. My question deals more with China and Russia's role in the embargoes, and how, if that is changing because of the steps that Trump now seems to be taking with increasing possible trade wars with China or more belligerency against Russia. Is there a shifting in that dynamic? And I'm thinking especially with the visit from the DPRK to China in that context. Can we anticipate or see any potential shifting in those forces?
Please.
I think that's a question for you. It's a good question. I actually want to know also.
Well, mine's a guess. You know, right now China, at least publicly, is saying that it's kind of holding to the international sanctions, but I think there's been leaks in the sanction program, quite a few leaks that China does let stuff come in, and I don't know how they would get stuff into North Korea except across the rivers. But you know, I think China is in a corner in a way because they want to be a participant in the international community, but they know that all the pressures that are put on North Korea ultimately could backfire, and they don't want to put ultimate pressure on them, but they want to kind of go along on one level with the international community. I'm not familiar though with how they're kind of working this and the details on how they are allowing goods to come into China. This whole issue about coal and, you know, moving of coal and any other products, mineral products, into China. I'm not sure quite how they're doing it because there is a pretty strong sanctions on these North Korean boats. And I think North Korean boats, cargo ships, are being stopped in various places to not let them unload.
Chuck was Chuck, and then I think Joe, you was the last one.
So I actually have two different things. I understand that at the New Year's speech in North Korea, that the statement was made that we've now completed our nuclear program, and we're going to channel our funds towards development. How do you see that? Is it happening? And then my second question, we haven't talked at all about Japan's kind of engagement with North Korea, and I know that Abe said that he would meet with Un, and I don't know if Abe will stay in office much longer, but how do you see the Japanese engagement with North Korea happening?
Well, I think Abe is certainly the odd man out. He's been left out of everything, so he's desperately trying to show that he's relevant in Northeast Asia. So holding his nose, saying that he would meet with Kim Jong-un, I think he does want to do that, but I wouldn't look toward him doing much positive with that opportunity. I think it'd be purely for show. And the whole issue of the occupation of the Korean Peninsula by the Japanese is still something that is very, very raw. So I'm not too sure Kim Jong-un would think that that Abe is so far down on his list of priorities, I would think. And he would get great support from both his people in North Korea and probably the ones from South Korea too. It's like Abe butt out.
I saw a cartoon recently that was drawn by a Japanese, I think, leftist organization, and it was like cherry blossoms, and then you had 4 leaves or blossoms with a face of Kim Jong-un, Moon Jae-in, Trump, and Xi Jinping, and then there was a blossom that was falling on the ground, and that was a picture of Abe. So I think the sentiment in Japan also is that, yes, there is a Japan passing situation going on here. Yeah, I think he needs to first, address the comfort women issue, some historic issues that need to be addressed by the Abe government. But in answer to your first question, yes, the New Year speech was the first sort of signal that we got about all of this that happened this year, right? Basically, Kim Jong-un announced, yes, we have now completed our nuclear deterrence, and then we're going to now move on to other priorities. 1, reunification with the South, and 2, economic development. And I think economic development we hear much less about, but I think we will see also concerted effort in that. Like one of the things that I know is happening is there's this place called Sepo Mound, which was this vast area that spans 3 counties that used to be a very infertile land. And it was land that was so neglected that they are still finding like fragments of bombs and mines and grenades from the Korean War 65 years ago. But they have now turned that into a ranch so that they can raise cattle, grazing animals, so that they can provide dairy for the entire country. So things like that I know are happening, and I think we'll see more of. Yeah.
So, Joe, last question.
But before Joe, it is worth reading that New Year's Day speech. It is really a remarkable speech. The part about it of nuclear weapons and all of that is just one little section where we heard a little bit about that in the U.S., but we didn't hear about the 90% of the speech, which was on economic development. And he went through sector by sector by sector by sector of what needed to be happening and what their plans were for this. So we got a very distorted view of what his vision is for his own country.
A couple of things. One, I'd like to point out that when the truce happened back in '53, I think it was, the Russian and the Chinese troops that were in Korea and the U.S., they all agreed that they would leave. The Russian and the Chinese troops left. The U.S. didn't leave. And it's till today. But I wanted to talk more about South Korea because back in January, I forget which politician said it. I think it was a U.S. politician saying that the South Korean president was off the leash, meaning he wasn't asking the U.S., can I do this or that? He just did it. And around, I don't know if it was in January or February, Trump made a statement sort of threatening the economy of South Korea, that tariffs or, he didn't spell it out, but it was a veiled threat that if South Korea doesn't do what the U.S. wants, there are ways to put pressure on the South Koreans. I just wondered if you could expound on that. You know, what kind of relationship between South Korea and the U.S. is there? Can they do a lot before the U.S. starts pushing back?
Yeah, so the U.S. and South Korea have a free trade agreement that was negotiated back in 2006, and we had many protests at each round of the negotiations to oppose that. But it was, I think, signed in 2008 maybe, and went into force a couple years later. And when Trump came in, he said, oh, this is an unfair trade agreement, we need to renegotiate it so that it's more advantageous to U.S. industries. And so there have been series of negotiations to renegotiate the terms of the deal. And now Trump, I think what you're referring to is Trump basically said, okay, we're going to put this on hold until we see what happens with these upcoming talks, right? So it's in a way Trump's way of trying to control the South, saying, you know, we'll see how these talks go before we actually, you know, come to an agreement on this, on the free trade agreement. So it's the U.S. way of trying to sort of rein in the Moon Jae-in government. The reason why I mentioned in my presentation earlier that Moon Jae-in government, yes, he is bold and eager to re-engage with North Korea, but it also seems that he is looking behind his shoulder and being very cautious about the U.S. because, you know, his public statements so far about the North-South summit has been, he keeps bringing up the issue of denuclearization. Now, I've consistently have said that is not an issue for discussion between the North and South. That is an issue to be discussed between North Korea and the U.S. North and South need to talk about reunification, go back to the 2000 agreement, the 2007 agreement, reaffirm we are going to reunify independently without foreign forces. Denuclearization, North Korea has always said, we have nuclear weapons because of the threat from the U.S. So, in order to get rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons, you have to remove the U.S. threat. That can only be discussed between the U.S. and North Korea. Moon Jae-in cannot guarantee North Korea removal of the U.S. threat, right? But the reason why he keeps bringing, and of course he knows this, he's not dumb to this, but the reason why he keeps bringing up denuclearization, I wonder in my mind, is because Pompeo apparently has been very central to you know, arranging the upcoming Kim-Trump summit. And Pompeo and his counterpart in South Korea, the intelligence person there, Seo-hun, are both playing a very central role in arranging for the upcoming summits. I think Pompeo, through the Moon Jae-in government, wants to confirm that North Korea is really committed to denuclearization, which is why they keep wanting Moon Jae-in to keep bringing up this issue in relation to the North-South summit. We'll see how things play out, but I think that you know, it would be very important for South Korea to play a very specific role in the upcoming North-South summit, which is really go back to the discussion about North-South unification.
Okay. So, applause to the speakers. And I know that there are a lot of friends and comrades, compañeros and compañeras are here. So I hope you have a better understanding about what's going on in Korea, and also, you know, people around the world in Korea and outside Korea. People are really working hard to end the Korean War and other wars. So I hope, you know, you join the part of the whole movements. And thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you.